again, for VCs, right? And in some, for most of them, they're looking for extremely high returns on a couple, right? They take multiple bets. And if you look at why they probably decided, I'm just going to generalize here. Why did they decide to go for a lot of these riots and Blizzard and stuff like this? Because there's a literal report saying that if you were X Riot, you got this much extra money, percentually speaking, from the last couple of years of investments, right? It's because these companies and these people have proven that they've either exited before, they've delivered an extreme amount of revenue and a lot of community building, and they, generally speaking, from a factual standpoint, if I invest in 10 Riot people versus 10 indie developers, my chances of hitting that unicorn, that one company out of these 10 that will pay back the other 9, theoretically, and more, is a much higher chance, again, in theory. Now, I think what the VCs are starting to understand, which is why so many indie developers are like, but that's not correct, Pontus, or that's not how it works, is that is not how it works, right? You can't just put together a bunch of incredible AAA people and make 15 different games and expect them all to sell as well as League of Legends. Because in today's market, you can make an indie game that sells as good as a game that has a $20 million production budget or $40 million or $60 million production budget, right? So if I was a VC today working on the equity side, at least for myself, I would focus more on doing 20 or 30 of these mid-sized studios rather than 5 or 10 of these like super AAA. And you can always combine it, right? You don't have to have an entire studio of AAA people. And there are many ways you can structure deals to make it work. But yeah, again, the question was like, what's the difference between the current buy side and sell side versus the VCs? So again, the VCs are looking for extremely high returns. If they get an acquisition around 3 or 4 times their initial investments 2 years into it, the chances are they're probably not going to do it, right? So they're looking for a completely different return than angels, for example, or private investors or other types of funds. So when we talked about like financing on the VC side, there are many other ways to find capital. Today, debt financing is very hard to do, and usually you don't get great deals. A couple of years ago, you could borrow millions of dollars for interest rates of 2% or less, right? Like sometimes even lower than that. So it was a lot easier to have access to capital. But that aside, angels, for example, I'm an angel myself. I've done 9 angel investments. I'm happy with a 5x. I'm happy if somebody wants to buy up my share 3-4 years later for a 5 times, because my return of capital is much smaller. And like, I'm just looking for cool businesses where hopefully I make some money down some years down the line, and I get other types of value for being part of that company. But a VC doesn't have that same thing. They need to consistently generate somewhere between 15 and 25% IRR over the course of the fund. And usually there's a timeline. So not all funds have this, but most of them do. To answer another generalist question, which within X amount of years, they need to return the fund and more. Which means if they're nearing the end of the fund, there is a chance that they may have to exit certain deals at valuations that might not be profitable, or the other way around. Like basically being, what's it called in English? Flexible with their deals. So a lot of these VCs works with bankers like ourselves to find ways to exit their portfolio. But yeah, again, we can continue talking about this for more. We can.
It syncs right along with. There was an article I read the other week there, and somebody went around GDC asking people what indie devs want, and there was a lot of frustration that a lot of the investment seemed to go to these gigantic games and companies where investors wanted hundreds of millions in return, and there's a frustration in the fact that why don't they take that money and instead of investing in $100 million game, they invest in whatever, $52 million or whatever, more lower risk things. And I mean, I don't disagree. I mean,
let's make it simple, right? Most indie games will never sell over $5 or $10 million. It's just not a big enough market. It might not have the right graphics, the right loop, whatever it may be, right? But the fact of the matter is this: if I invest in you as an indie developer, and probably an early entrepreneur, maybe you haven't launched games yet, because usually these are the entrepreneurs complaining about VCs. You take 3 years or more to actually build a game, right? That's what it's going to take you to make your first game. Now, me as an angel, I'm okay if that first game fails, because why not? Like, I'm investing in you. I believe in you, the entrepreneur. So the first game fails, breaks even, makes a small return, whatever. You're going to make the next game, and that's when I get my money. So year 6, year 7, you'll have Pontus being like, oh, oh, I made a 5x, a 10x. Awesome. This is great. Now, that 5 to 10x is probably because your game only grossed within that 5 to 10 million range, right? Because you're not probably going to have $100 million or $1 billion franchise. The chances of that are very low. But going back to the point, 6 or 7 years, right? If I invest in a triple A studio or a double A studio, most likely my chances of success on an average scale, which has been proven wrong, is that I have a much higher chance of generating $100 million in one of these studios than in one of yours. And it will be a lot faster. I can tell you from working with indie developers for 10 years, indies get consistently delayed over and over. So does AAA, but on a much different scale. And the chances of me generating that multiple of return on indie in the time span I need as a VC is extremely low. And that's why most VCs decide to go for these more experienced teams who know how to deliver, know how to lower their delays as little as possible, which a much higher chance of a massive revenue influx, rather than 10 smaller investments that could take 5, 6, 7 years before you generate a game that actually makes money. And the thing is, just because your second game makes money doesn't mean you're sellable. Not at all, right? You don't necessarily become an acquisition case just because you sold 500,000 units. And even if you do, what is your actual profit on those 500,000 units? And what is your ultimate valuation?